In the late 1930s, as Japan sought to cement its status as the dominant naval power of East Asia, the Imperial Japanese Navy made a decision that would shape the destiny of its fleet and ultimately doom it. Convinced that the United States would someday challenge its expansion across the Pacific, Japanese naval planners embraced an old doctrine, the Kantai Kessen, the belief that a single Titanic fleet engagement between battleships would determine the outcome of the war. The Americans had more shipyards, more steel, and a vastly larger industrial base, so Japan could not hope to match the U.S. Navy ship for ship. Instead, Japanese admirals pursued a different logic. If they could not build more ships, they would build bigger ones. From this mindset emerged the Yamato-class battleships, Yamato and Musashi, the largest, heaviest, and most heavily armed warships ever launched by any nation. They were designed and constructed under conditions of extraordinary secrecy between 1937 and 1942. Their hull numbers disguised, their slipways hidden behind high walls, and their specifications known only to a handful of officers and engineers. The goal was to produce warships so powerful that no American or British battleship could stand against them. At full load, Musashi displaced more than 72,000 tons, with armor plating thicker than any shell then in existence could reliably penetrate. Her main battery consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship, capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 1.5 tons over 40 kilometers. Her designers believed she could outrange, outgun, and outlast anything the U.S. Navy could send against her. This enormous vessel was not merely a ship, it was a symbol. To the Japanese, Musashi represented naval invincibility, a floating fortress that embodied the nation's industrial pride, technical mastery, and warrior tradition. Every aspect of her construction reflected the strategic assumptions of the pre-war era, that battleships would still meet in line of battle formations, that gunnery duels would decide control of the seas, and that victory belonged to the nation with the largest, hardest-hitting vessels afloat. The Japanese had observed the naval race of World War I and concluded that the only way to counter America's ability to build many ships was to build ships that were categorically superior. A single Yamato-class battleship, they argued, could take on multiple American battleships and survive. Musashi was commissioned in 1942, designated as the flagship of the combined fleet after Yamato, and selected personally by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto as his command ship. She hosted the planning sessions for Japan's most daring operations, including the ill-fated decision to shoot down Yamamoto's transport aircraft during Operation Vengeance, a grim reminder that even the world's most powerful battleship could not protect the man who trusted it. But as Musashi entered service, the strategic world around her was already shifting. The carrier-based raid on Pearl Harbor and the Battle of the Coral Sea had revealed the new reality. Aircraft, not battleships, were now the decisive arm of naval warfare. The sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse by Japanese bombers in December 1941 further demonstrated that even heavily armored capital ships were vulnerable to air power. Yet Japan pressed ahead with its battleship doctrine, believing that Yamato and Musashi would still have their moment in a decisive surface engagement. Musashi's early career, however, did not resemble the epic gunnery duels she had been built for. Instead of challenging American battleships, she spent much of 1942 and 1943 escorting convoys, protecting troop transports, and serving as a command vessel. Her massive 18.1-inch guns were rarely fired in anger. Her immense armor was never tested by enemy shells, and her designers' dreams of obliterating U.S. battleships at long range faded into irrelevance as the Pacific War evolved into a contest dominated by aircraft carriers, submarines, and airfields. Musashi was a masterpiece designed for a world that no longer existed. Japanese engineers had given her unmatched firepower and protection, but they had not prepared her for the new form of naval warfare now sweeping the Pacific. Her anti-aircraft suite, though expanded repeatedly, from dozens to more than 130 guns by 1944, could not protect her from the swarms of American carrier aircraft that would eventually hunt her down. As she sailed toward the Philippines in late 1944 as part of Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, Musashi still embodied the hopes of a naval strategy forged decades earlier. But the battle she would face in the Sibuyan Sea on October 24, 1944, would prove that size, armor, and guns meant nothing in the face of modern American air power. The world's largest battleship had finally reached the war she had been built for, only to discover that her era had already passed her by.
When Musashi officially entered service in August 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy treated her not as a mere warship, but as the beating heart of a grand strategy already slipping into obsolescence. She became the new flagship of the combined fleet, succeeding her sister ship Yamato, and instantly transformed into a floating symbol of national pride. Her immense bulk, towering pagoda mast, and triple 18.1-inch turrets made her appear less like a vessel and more like a mountain of steel sliding across the sea. Crewmen from destroyers and cruisers stared upward as she passed, whispering that no enemy shell could crack her armor and no ship afloat could match her guns. Musashi, like Yamato, embodied Japan's final hope for a decisive surface victory. Yet, the war around her was evolving faster than Japanese strategy could adapt. In her first year at sea, Musashi did not engage American battleships or participate in the epic line of battle duels she had been built for. Instead, she spent months shuttling across the Inland Sea and the Central Pacific, alternately serving as Yamamoto's command ship and escorting critical troop movements. Her most significant early role was one she was never designed for, transporting the combined fleet commander himself. In April 1943, Yamamoto boarded Musashi for the last time before departing by air for an inspection tour of the Solomons, a trip from which he would never return. When U.S. codebreakers intercepted his itinerary and American P-38 Lightnings intercepted and shot down his aircraft during Operation Vengeance, it was Musashi that recovered his remains. The world's largest battleship had become the guardian of the fallen architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. Meanwhile, Japan continued to expand Musashi's anti-aircraft defenses in response to rising American air power. Her deck bristled with increasingly dense layers of 25mm Type 96 guns, supplemented by 127mm dual-purpose mounts and an elaborate array of directors and fire control systems. By 1944, she carried more than 130 anti-aircraft weapons, an extraordinary number for a battleship, and yet Japanese officers privately acknowledged that these measures were desperate attempts to compensate for the growing dominance of American carrier aviation. The very fact that Musashi needed so many guns revealed the strategic crisis Japan faced. Musashi remained untouched in major fleet actions through 1943, but her reputation only grew. Crews whispered that she was unsinkable, that even torpedo bombers could barely dent her armor belt, and that she might someday fire the opening salvo in the decisive Kantai-Kessen battle the Navy had dreamed of for decades. American intelligence identified Musashi and Yamato as super battleships, treating them as high-priority threats, but the U.S. Navy increasingly understood that their massive guns mattered far less than their vulnerability to air attack. Carrier battles, Coral Sea, Midway, the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, had already demonstrated that battleships could no longer determine the outcome of naval war. Still, Japan persisted in treating Musashi as a strategic centerpiece. In early 1944, as the Americans pressed deeper into the Central Pacific, she was transferred to the Marianas to reinforce the fleet. During the June 1944 Battle of the Philippine Sea, known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Musashi finally witnessed the full horror of the New Age. Japanese carrier aircraft were slaughtered in unprecedented numbers by U.S. Hellcats in anti-air fire. Though Musashi herself was not significantly damaged, the battle proved beyond doubt that Japan could no longer contest American air control. Her enormous guns remained silent throughout the engagement. Even as American carriers annihilated Japanese naval aviation, the super battleship could contribute nothing. After the disastrous loss of Japanese carrier air power, the combined fleet withdrew to Lingo Roads near Singapore. There, Musashi and Yamato consumed precious fuel simply to conduct training exercises. They were too large, too fuel-hungry, and too slow to deploy quickly. Japan was running out of oil, and every sortie for the super battleships became an agonizing strategic gamble. Yet, despite these realities, Japanese planners still hoped the enormous vessels might turn the tide when the time came to defend the Philippines, Japan's last remaining shield before the home islands. That moment arrived in October 1944, when Allied forces began landing on Leyte. In response, the Japanese launched Operation Shogo, a complex multi-pronged counterattack designed to trap and annihilate the American invasion fleet. Musashi, centerpiece of Kurita's center force, finally sailed toward what admirals believed might be the grand, decisive battle she had been meant for since the day her keel was laid. But the world she entered in October 1944 was not the world Japan had prepared her for. The U.S. Navy no longer fought with battleships seeking line-of-battle duels. It fought with a weapon Musashi was never designed to resist: fast carrier groups capable of launching massed airstrikes from hundreds of kilometers away. As Musashi steamed through the Visayan waters and entered the Sibuyan Sea, she carried more anti-aircraft guns than any battleship in history, an armor belt thicker than any opponent could pierce with shells, and the most powerful naval artillery ever mounted on a ship. But none of it would matter in the battle to come. Her legend was towering, her presence intimidating, but the age she belonged to was already gone. On the morning of October 24, 1944, as the first waves of American aircraft descended upon Kurita's formation, Musashi's crew finally witnessed what no Japanese naval strategist of the 1930s truly understood. In the modern Pacific War, a battleship, no matter how colossal, was nothing more than a target. The era of giants was ending, and Musashi was sailing straight into the storm that would destroy her myth forever. Dawn broke over the Sibuyan Sea on October 24, 1944, with a deceptive calm. The water was glassy, the sky streaked with pale gold, and Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, moved in tight formation toward the San Bernardino Strait. Their mission was nothing less than the destruction of the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. At the core of this armada loomed Musashi, her hull vast and dark, her massive 18-inch turrets pointing forward like the guns of a fortress on the march. She was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the most heavily armed and armored battleship ever built, and Japan fully expected her to spearhead the decisive counterblow they had dreamed of since 1941. But over the eastern horizon, the carriers of Halsey's Fast Carrier Task Force were already preparing the weapon that would end her reign: the massed air power of modern naval warfare. TF-38's reconnaissance aircraft had sighted Kurita's force earlier that morning, and the American response was immediate and overwhelming. The carriers Essex, Lexington, Intrepid, Franklin, Enterprise, Cabot, and Independence fueled and armed their air groups with practiced speed. Within minutes, the first wave of Helldivers, Avengers, and Hellcats clawed into the sky. The battle that followed would demonstrate with terrifying clarity that no amount of steel or firepower could protect a battleship from the concentrated air assault of a fully modern carrier fleet. The first American attack arrived shortly before 10 a.m. Dive bombers from Intrepid and Cabot screamed down through scattered cloud layers, their canopies rattling as they plunged toward Kurita's formation. Musashi's anti-aircraft guns erupted in a deafening roar. 25mm Type 96 cannon firing in fountains of tracers, 127mm dual-purpose guns thundering as they filled the sky with bursts of black shrapnel. The air above her became a swirling storm of fire, but the Helldivers did what American pilots had been trained relentlessly to do. They drove straight through it. Musashi took the first of many hits, a 500-pound bomb that smashed into her forward deck,
penetrating deep before exploding. Almost simultaneously, the first torpedoes struck her sideboard, rupturing compartments and flooding lower decks. The great battleship shuddered. Damage control crews rushed to seal the flooding, but the assault had only begun. Within an hour, a second wave arrived, this one larger, more coordinated, and more lethal. TF-38 unleashed everything from high-altitude fighters carrying bombs to Avengers armed with torpedoes. The strikes came from multiple directions, forcing Musashi's gunners to split their fire and diluting the effectiveness of even her enormous anti-aircraft battery. American pilots executed a classic pincer attack. Dive bombers assaulted from above, drawing fire upward, while torpedo bombers swept in at sea level where gunners were unable to track them effectively. Musashi's armor, thick enough to deflect any naval shell, was never designed to withstand this kind of attack. Delivered from the air, repeated without pause, and striking in places no battleship designer of the 1930s had considered vulnerable. By early afternoon, she had already taken enough blows to cripple a lesser ship. Yet still she fought, her anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with so much lead that surviving pilots described it as climbing through a volcano. But the Americans kept coming. The third strike, launched shortly after 1 p.m., was the most devastating. Avengers from Essex, Lexington, and Enterprise coordinated a torpedo assault that hit Musashi on both port and starboard sides, the worst possible scenario for a ship that relied on counterflooding to preserve stability. Each torpedo sent shockwaves through her hull, buckling armor plates and tearing open compartments below the waterline. The flooding became uncontrollable. Musashi began to list, first gently, then with alarming speed. Damage control teams fought with extraordinary determination, wading through rising water to shore up bulkheads and jettison ammunition. But every effort they made was undone by the next wave of American aircraft. By mid-afternoon, the total number of hits had climbed to catastrophic levels. 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, according to post-war assessments. Water poured into the starboard side faster than pumps could expel it. The fourth and fifth waves delivered the final blows. Bombs smashed into her main deck, knocking out turrets and fire control positions. Torpedoes ruptured her port side, destroying her ability to counterflood and sending her into a fatal starboard list. Her speed dropped from 22 knots to 10, then 6, then 5. A battleship that once symbolized unstoppable strength now crawled helplessly through the Sibuyan Sea, barely able to steer. By late afternoon, Kurita reluctantly ordered his surviving ships to leave Musashi behind. The ocean around her was stained with oil, littered with debris, and filled with the bodies of Japanese sailors thrown into the water during earlier blasts. American aircraft circled overhead like hawks, photographing the dying giant as she slowed to a halt. At 7:30 p.m., after hours of agonizing struggle, Musashi capsized to starboard and slipped beneath the surface, taking more than 1,000 crewmen with her. Incredibly, throughout the entire battle, not a single American ship was lost. Japan's greatest battleship had been destroyed not by gunfire, not by surface engagement, but by the overwhelming, unstoppable power of U.S. carrier aviation. Japanese admirals, once confident that Yamato and Musashi would dominate any naval battlefield, were left stunned. Everything they believed about decisive surface warfare had been shattered in a single afternoon. The sinking of Musashi was more than a tactical loss. It was a symbolic execution of the battleship era itself. The age of giants had ended, and the future of naval war belonged to the airplane.
As the sun set on the Sibuyan Sea on October 24, 1944, the full meaning of Musashi's destruction began to sink in, not only among the men who had watched her die, but across the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. For years, Japan had poured its engineering genius, industrial resources, and strategic faith into the idea that a battleship could still dominate the Pacific. Musashi's immense armor, her triple 18.1-inch turrets, and her reputation as an unsinkable titan had all been part of a grand vision harking back to the era of Tsushima and World War I. Yet, in a single brutal afternoon, wave after wave of American carrier aircraft had reduced that vision to twisted steel and black oil drifting across the Sibuan Sea. And the more the Japanese examined the battle, the more they realized that Musashi's fall had been inevitable. The first reason for that inevitability lay in the design logic that created the Yamato class. Battleship designers in the 1930s built ships to fight other ships. Their calculations assumed gunnery duels, angled armor belts, plunging shell fire, and engagements fought over line-of-sight ranges. Musashi's 409mm armor belt could shrug off shells from any American battleship. Her magazines, turret faces, and conning tower were shielded by protective layers unmatched anywhere else in naval architecture. But none of that mattered when the Americans bypassed the paradigm entirely. Carrier-based aircraft did not duel. They attacked from above, from multiple angles, at multiple altitudes, using weapons the Yamato class had never been designed to resist. The second fatal flaw was Musashi's vulnerability to asymmetric flooding. Battleships survived torpedo hits by counter-flooding compartments on the opposite side to maintain stability. But at Sibuan Sea, TF-38's Avengers struck Musashi from both port and starboard. With every incoming wave, torpedoes slammed into alternating sides of the hull, tearing open long seams and destroying internal bulkheads. The result was a nightmare scenario for any damage control officer. Counter-flooding became impossible because both sides were compromised. The ship's stability evaporated. Even with flawless coordination, crews could not outpace the rising sea water. The bombs inflicted their own brand of devastation. Dive bombers pierced Musashi's deck near her forward turrets, collapsing internal compartments and knocking out electrical systems that powered pumps, steering mechanisms, and turret rotation. Fires broke out across multiple decks. Though Japanese crews fought with ferocious determination, venting smoke, sealing ruptures, and even hand-pumping water when automated systems failed, the sheer volume of damage overwhelmed them. A third factor was the collapse of Japan's air defenses. Musashi had more than 130 anti-aircraft guns by 1944, a staggering number for any warship, yet she faced attacks designed specifically to defeat them. American pilots used multi-axis assaults, a tactic developed from bitter experience at Coral Sea and Midway. Helldivers attacked from high angles, forcing the 127mm guns upward. Avengers skimmed the waterline, slipping under the field of fire. Hellcats swooped in from mid-altitude to distract gunners. No matter where Musashi pointed her guns, another wave struck from an angle her crews could not cover. The Type 96 25mm AA guns, Japan's most common anti-aircraft weapon, had severe shortcomings: slow traverse speed, heavy vibration, and no powered stabilization. They were easily overwhelmed by fast-diving aircraft. As the battle wore on, gunners reported barrels glowing red, ammunition depleted, and firing platforms rattling so violently they were nearly unusable. Musashi's enormous size, once a symbol of power, became a liability. She was simply too big to protect, too big to maneuver, and too slow to escape. Fourth, U.S. air power was not merely overwhelming, it was coordinated with mathematical precision. TF-38's total of 259 sorties against Musashi represented the largest aerial attack ever conducted against a single ship to that date. Pilots communicated in real time, adjusting torpedo patterns to exploit lists and damaged bulkheads. They targeted engineering sections to reduce speed, bombed steering compartments to cripple maneuverability, and focused torpedoes low on the hull where the armor belt tapered. By mid-afternoon, Musashi was limping at 5 knots, barely able to steer, a drifting target for the next assault. Japanese officers later admitted that once Musashi's speed dropped below 10 knots, her survival was mathematically impossible. Battleship armor assumed mobility. Without it, she became a barge waiting to be sunk. A fifth and final factor was psychological and decisive. Japan had built the Yamato class to embody a myth that a single super battleship could change the course of a war. But in the Sibuan Sea, that myth collapsed. American carrier air groups worked as a single, flexible organism, adapting with each attack, sharing intelligence, and maintaining relentless pressure. Japan's hope for a decisive surface battle had died at Midway. Musashi's sinking was simply the final, irrefutable proof. Even Admiral Kurita, who watched Musashi fall farther and farther behind as flooding worsened, understood the significance. His earlier belief that the super battleships could spearhead a breakthrough evaporated as Musashi became unable to keep formation. In his report, Kurita wrote with blunt honesty, "Air attacks alone sank Musashi." When the great ship finally rolled to starboard and slipped beneath the waves at 1936, she left behind a massive oil slick, hundreds of lifeboats, and the bodies of men who had fought with unwavering courage. But she also left behind something larger, the death of the battleship age. Musashi's demise showed the world that armor, guns, and size were obsolete metrics of naval power. The future belonged to speed, reach, and the ability to project force from beyond the horizon. The men who designed Musashi had not been wrong. They had simply been overtaken by history, and no amount of steel could stop that tide. When the last bubbles of air escaped from Musashi's upturned hull and the sea closed over the greatest battleship ever built, a silence fell over the Subian Sea that no eyewitness ever forgot. More than 1,000 Japanese sailors drifted through the oil-slicked darkness, clinging to wreckage, calling out for comrades, watching the distant silhouettes of Kurita's surviving ships vanish into the dusk. Musashi, Japan's titan of steel, the pride of its fleet, the embodiment of its naval doctrine, was gone. Her loss reverberated throughout the Imperial Japanese Navy with the force of a revelation. In a single battle, without a single American ship being sunk, the entire foundation of Japan's battleship-centric strategy had been shattered beyond repair. In the days that followed, Japanese naval officers tried to make sense of what had happened. Many had devoted their entire careers to the belief that armored giants would decide the fate of nations. Now they were left confronting a brutal truth. Musashi had not failed because she was poorly built or poorly commanded. She had failed because she belonged to an era that had already ended. Her death was the final verdict on a doctrine that had dominated naval thinking for half a century, a doctrine that American carrier pilots swept aside in a matter of hours. The Imperial Japanese Navy had always known that the United States possessed a vast industrial capacity, but the Musashi's sinking showed something even more decisive. America had mastered the art of modern naval warfare. Carrier air power, not battleship gunnery, was now the measure of sea control. Where Musashi could strike at targets 40 kilometers away, American carriers could strike at targets hundreds of kilometers distant. Where Musashi required thousands of men to operate her guns and engines, American air groups could deliver the same destructive power with dozens of aircraft flown by pilots barely in their 20s. The contrast was devastating. For the Japanese high command, recovering from the shock was impossible. Even before Musashi sank, Japan's naval aviation had been crippled at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The loss of Musashi confirmed that Japan could no longer rely on surface forces to halt the American advance. Yamato, her sister ship, would be sent on her own suicide mission 6 months later, Operation Ten-Go, where she too would be sunk entirely by aircraft before firing a single main gun shell at an American warship. The super battleships, once imagined as the backbone of Japan's maritime destiny, had become relics before they ever had a chance to prove themselves. For the Americans, Musashi's destruction carried a different kind of significance. It validated the entire strategic philosophy the U.S. Navy had embraced since the early stages of the war: mobility, flexibility, and the projection of power from the sky. The Fast Carrier Task Force, TF-38, had demonstrated that a modern navy did not need to risk capital ships in surface duels. Instead, it could destroy the enemy at a distance, dictate the terms of engagement, and overwhelm even the strongest ship with a storm of coordinated aerial attacks. The fact that no U.S. ship was lost during the engagement was not merely a tactical success, it was a strategic triumph. It proved that the era of the battleship was irreversibly over. Among naval historians, Musashi's legacy has since evolved into a profound lesson in the intersection of technology, doctrine, and timing. If Musashi had sailed in 1918, she would have been unstoppable. If she had faced American battleships instead of American aircraft, she might have dominated the Pacific. But she entered the world at the worst possible moment, the dawn of an age where her strengths were irrelevant and her weaknesses fatal.
Her armor could not stop torpedoes dropped from above. Her guns could not fire at enemies beyond the horizon. Her massive displacement made her a target first, a weapon second. And even her crew, among the finest in the fleet, could not overcome the physics of a ship hit by 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. Yet Musashi's legacy is not simply one of failure. She symbolizes the end of an epoch, the final expression of a battleship race that began with HMS Dreadnought in 1906 and ended, decisively, in the waters of the Philippines. She represents human ambition at its most immense and its most misguided, a belief that bigger and stronger could always triumph, even as the world changed around it. Her wreck, discovered in 2015 by the expedition led by Paul Allen, lies in nearly 3,000 feet of water. Photographs of her shattered bow and collapsed turrets evoke awe and sorrow in equal measure. They remind the world of the men who fought and died aboard her, of the engineers who dared to create her, and of the admirals who believed she could alter the fate of nations. What she ultimately proved was something far larger and more enduring, that technological eras rise and fall, that the weapons of one generation cannot win the wars of the next, and that strategy must evolve or perish. Musashi did not sink because she was weak. She sank because the world had moved on. In that sense, the Musashi's final gift to history was clarity. She showed with tragic force that the battleship age had died, and the future of naval power belonged to the carriers, the pilots, and the relentless reach of the airplane. Her death marked the twilight of giants and the dawn of a new kind of war.